I want to welcome everyone to our second thesis presentation class. We have in our extended audience CISAC faculty and fellows and alumni and friends and family. Want to welcome all of you. A special thanks to our faculty advisors of today's student thesis presenters, Dr. Catherine Stoner, Professor Andy Grotto. Some of you have been to our last session, but for those of you who are new, you'll see that we're trying to keep a classroom feel. So we have faculty and advisors and our students in the classroom on the screen, and many more people who are not on the screen. Each of our presenters today will speak for 20 minutes. Dr. Muir has an old-fashioned handwritten stop sign to make sure that we keep the time. We're going to have, there it is. We're going to have 10 minutes of Q&A, starting with the folks in the class, and then we want to open it up to everybody. So if you would like to ask a question, you can do it in Zoom fashion by just typing your question in the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen, and we'll be sure to try to get to as many of your questions as we can. We're going to do our best to stay on time. There'll be a break between our two presentations. Okay. Why don't we get started with our first presenter, Yasmin Samrai. Yasmin is an international student from the UK. She is studying both history and economics here at Stanford. She has visited Russia 3 times and is studying Russian language, and she's developed a deep interest, as you'll see in a minute, in the country and a historical analysis that makes sense of Russian foreign policy. Her thesis title today is called The Geopolitical Blame Game, Russia's Strategy of Weaponizing Grievances Against the West. And her advisor, and we're very grateful to her advisor, is Dr. Catherine Stoner. So Yasmin, take it away.
Thank you, Dr. Stieger, and welcome everyone to my honors thesis presentation. I'll begin by sharing my slides. My thesis is on the geopolitical blame game, Russia's strategy of weaponizing grievances against the West. Russia throbs with both real and imagined grievances. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the Kremlin has accumulated a litany of grievances about the West, spanning everything from NATO's national security threat to America's liberal hegemony, from the economic sanctions of the European Union to the cultural degeneracy of the West, grievance upon grievance. As President Vladimir Putin told an international discussion forum in 2017, our most serious mistake in relations with the West is that we trusted you too much. And your mistake is that you took that trust as weakness and abused it. In this grievance, along with many others that Putin's predecessors aired, the Russian president reduces Cold War relations between Russia and the West to a series of broken promises and betrayals. My thesis interrogates this revisionist narrative, asking, what are the sources and strategic aims of Russia's grievances against the West? This very question challenges the conventional assumption that grievances are mere rhetorical devices by entertaining the possibility that grievances could be strategic. To investigate this question, I examined a data set of grievances and conducted an in-depth case study on NATO. This led me to argue that Russian presidents exploit grievances, both sincere and strategic, as political instruments to increase their domestic legitimacy, as well as to achieve their geopolitical ambitions. In this presentation, I will present a framework for grievance narratives, explain the results of my data set and case study, and then conclude with some implications for policymakers and scholars. So let's begin with the theory. Grievances in the geopolitical context are real or imagined wrongs that prompt one state to accuse another state of unjust or unfair treatment. A series of these grievances are called grievance narratives. I should emphasize that the grievances that make up a narrative are not spontaneous, unregulated outbursts from a politician here or there, but rather carefully coordinated and scripted displays from the political leadership. So while resentment is a universal political phenomenon, only a couple of countries count as aggrieved states. According to the former Assistant Secretary of State, Christopher Ford, the defining characteristics of an aggrieved state include a national identity rooted in an affronted grandeur, a perceived history of grievous wrongs and insults, a political leadership that relies on a foreign enemy, and a revisionist foreign policy agenda. In addition to Russia, China and Iran meet the definitions of an aggrieved state. The Chinese Communist Party relentlessly portrays China as a victim of foreign imperialist bullying during the so-called century of humiliation. Likewise, the Islamist ideology of the Iranian regime was formed in direct opposition to the West and draws on an imagination of collective shame to legitimize its clerical rule. Without an established literature on the subject of grievance narratives, unchecked assumptions have led scholars to different and often conflicting interpretations about the Kremlin's grievances. Some scholars assume that grievances reflect the sincere interests and discontents of the state. Other analysts dismiss grievances altogether as mere rhetoric that plays a supporting theatrical role to the state strategy. But the opposite could be the case. Grievances could be insincere, and grievances could play a leading role in strategy. To check the conventional assumptions around grievances, my thesis introduces the term instrumental grievance. These are tactical complaints that a state can raise to challenge, undermine, or gain leverage over an adversary. So now that I've provided a framework to think about grievance narratives, let's move on to my empirical study. To understand Russia's post-Soviet grievance against the West, I created a data set of Russian grievances from 1991, when President Boris Yeltsin became the first democratically elected leader of Russia, to 2020. To chart grievances across this politically tumultuous time period, I took off my history hat, donned my social science lab coat, and collected, categorized, and coded grievances. I selected official statements from the Russian president that explicitly complained about or criticized Western wrongdoing. So for the collection process, I read hundreds of presidential speeches, interviews, and strategic documents from the Kremlin and Boris Yeltsin Center archives to create a comprehensive data set of grievances. I used original Russian sources when the English translation was unavailable. I then categorized the grievances according to one of 5 themes that emerged naturally from the dataset. Then came the most interesting part. I coded the grievance as either instrumental or non-instrumental. To do this, I checked for evidence that the grievance had been explicitly exploited by the Russian president to undermine, challenge, or gain a tactical advantage over the West. The instrumentalization had to be evident from the primary source itself, either from the content of the grievance or in the president's statements initially preceding or following that grievance quotation. So what did I find? Ultimately, my data set includes 471 Russian grievances targeting the West from 1991 to 2020. This chart is a striking illustration of how anti-Western grievances have become an increasing feature of Russian presidential discourse. As you can see, post-Soviet Russia began to invoke grievances against the West as early as 1993. There are then sharp increases in the number of grievances in 1999, in 2007, and in 2014. So 1999 is when Yeltsin adopted outrage at the Nato bombing of Kosovo. In 2007, Putin adopted a more strident anti-Western stance, and most dramatically, we see this peak in 2014 as Putin used grievances over NATO as a pretext for Russia's annexation of Crimea that year. The science in the data also matters. The figure shows low levels of grievances in Yeltsin's first term from 1991 to 1996, as well as Medvedev's single presidential term from 2008 to 2012, both of which are generally considered to be periods of cooperation between Moscow and Washington. You can also see in 2020, grievances dip again, presumably because the coronavirus had consumed political life in Russia and, of course, the world in general. The majority of Russian grievances concern geopolitical and national security issues. The remaining grievances target disputes with the West over the economy, domestic politics, and ideology. Finally, and most surprisingly, I found that 19% of the grievances in the dataset were instrumentalized to gain a political advantage over the West. The remaining 81% of grievances showed no evidence of being explicitly instrumentalized. Although they do not appear to be political tools and tactics, non-instrumental grievances are still important rhetorical devices that could spin alternative accounts of events and have a persuasive effect on their audience. But let's focus our attention on instrumental grievances. I discovered 4 ways that Russia weaponizes grievances as a political instrument: to threaten retaliation, to legitimize military aggression, to make counter-accusations, and to shift blame for geopolitical crises away from Russia and onto the West. So I've told you that some grievances are instruments, but the next question becomes, what are they instrumental for? There are 3 possible explanations that emerge from the data set. that emerge from competing schools of thought within the literature on Russian foreign policy. When it comes to grievances, Russia's aims might be to defend its national security, to exert geopolitical influence and power, or to serve the leadership's domestic political interests. To gain greater clarity on the sources and strategic aims of Russian resentment, I tested my hypotheses or explanations against the case of NATO, which is the longest standing and most significant complaint from the Russian leadership about the West. In fact, the word NATO is the third most frequently used term in my dataset of grievances. By way of some background, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was founded in 1949 and served as the West Mutual Defense Alliance against the Soviet Union. However, the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact at the end of the Cold War was not met with a reciprocal move by NATO, which not only stayed intact, but grew ever larger to the dismay of President Boris Yeltsin and his government. At a security summit in 1994, Yeltsin warned that NATO's search for a new place in post-Cold War Europe would create new lines of demarcation. Europe, he said, runs the risk of plunging into a cold peace. At the time, the US President Bill Clinton reasoned that the end of the superpower rivalry had freed NATO from its Cold War mindset to adopt new political and military goals, above all, to integrate post-communist republics and to undertake crisis management operations on the European periphery. In line with those goals, NATO has undergone 5 rounds of enlargement since 1991 and conducted out-of-area operations in Yugoslavia in the 1990s, as well as in Libya in 2011. What are the sources and strategic aims of Russia's NATO grievance? Realist scholars argue that military threat perception drives Russian resentment towards the West. They point to Russia's invasion of Georgia in 2008 and Ukraine in 2014 as evidence that NATO enlargement has threatened Russia and provoked Russia into defending its national security. The fact that Russian presidents claim in grievance after grievance that NATO is a red line that threatens Russian security would seem to support the realist argument. However, grievances can be deceptive. When we assess the objective military implications of NATO on Russia, the realist argument becomes much less convincing. First, a basic but important fact. NATO has had no direct impact on the Russian state or territory. NATO has never invaded Russia, changed Russian borders, nor brought about the loss of Russian alliances or trade pacts. Second, Russian military officers, who are known to speak a little bit more candidly once they retire, have openly admitted that NATO presents no real military threat. Military data actually supports their claims. During 2 waves of NATO enlargement, the number of Russian soldiers and artillery deployed along its western and southern borders declined sharply, which is exactly the sort of opposite behavior from what you would expect. Third, Russia has a strategic advantage over NATO in conventional warfare and is more than capable of defending its territory against NATO with cruise missiles and a massive nuclear deterrent. Finally, Russia's grievance about NATO has been inconsistent. Russian leaders have at times cooperated closely with the alliance, only then to revive the grievance years later. To offer one anecdote that illustrates this inconsistency, Ambassador Michael McFaul recorded in his memoir that during his 5 years in the Obama administration, where he attended almost every meeting President Obama held with Putin and Medvedev, the issue of NATO never came up. If the Kremlin was truly concerned about NATO posing a national security threat, then Russian leaders would have pressed the issue much harder in private negotiations with their American counterparts. Other diplomats I interviewed, including former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, also noted a similar discrepancy between Russia's public and private grievances during her time in the George W. Bush administration. So perhaps the sources and strategic aims of Russia's NATO grievance lie elsewhere. The second explanation proposes that geopolitical concerns drive Russian resentment towards the West, and that Russia's grievances are instrumental for projecting geopolitical influence and power. I found this hypothesis to be convincing by contrast. Given evidence that Russia resents NATO because its physical and operational expansion has sent a painful message to the political elite that Russia is no longer the geopolitical equal of the United States, nor can influence major Western security decisions. In addition, I found evidence that Russia uses NATO to project geopolitical influence and power. For example, the Russian presidents used the grievance as a gambit in geopolitical bargaining and expansion. To give one memorable example, newly declassified memos show that President Boris Yeltsin actually bargained with President Clinton for membership in the major Western organizations in return for Russia going along with NATO expansion. Clinton actually agreed to some of these concessions, including inviting Russia to join the G7 in the late 1990s, not because the US National Security Team thought that NATO undermined Russia's security, but because they understood that NATO expansion symbolized Russia's decline as a major power. The third explanation supposes that domestic political interests drive Russian resentment towards the West, and that Russia's grievances are instrumental for the political elite to gain domestic legitimacy. This explanation is also compelling due to evidence that Russia's presidents are under intense political pressure from nationalists in the Russian government to oppose NATO. In turn, they strategically air grievances about NATO to avoid appearing to capitulate to the West, to bolster their domestic legitimacy, and to scapegoat problems at home. For example, President Dmitry Medvedev adopted anti-NATO grievances in 2009 to motivate the military reform and to sugarcoat job cuts in the Russian military. This is just one of many instances in which the Russian leadership have used the NATO grievance largely for domestic consumption. Overall, the Russian leadership inflates the military security grievance over NATO to bolster their domestic legitimacy and to project Russia's geopolitical power and influence. What does this case study show us? It shows us that even when a state actor does not harbor a sincere grievance, it might be still advantageous to exaggerate a red line to limit the adversary's range of options. Such strategic grievances are no longer sincere red lines that violate the state's core security, but symbolic red herrings that intend to mislead their target audience about the true source and aim of their resentment. I would like to conclude this presentation by highlighting the contributions of my research. My thesis contributes to the literature as the first comprehensive study of post-Soviet Russian grievances. The results of my data set and case study challenge conventional assumptions about grievances. And while other scholars usually treat grievances as a rhetorical device, my thesis offers a framework for thinking about grievances as a political diplomatic strategy. The Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, is known to bring little cards into his meetings with American diplomats. On these cards are written dozens and dozens of grievances. To derail the meeting, Foreign Minister Lavrov bombards his American diplomats with a list of irritants. Former US Ambassador to Russia, Michael McFaul, calls this the flood the zone tactic of grievances. Fiona Hill, the top advisor on Russia in the Trump administration, recounted a similar experience with Lavrov and other Russian diplomats, and argued their aim was never to redress the grievance, but to perpetuate it. Biden officials working on Russia policy are grappling with this very issue. How can they distinguish a sincere grievance from a strategic one? My thesis suggests that an inconsistent narrative, inaccurate or dubious accusations, a mismatch between words and deeds, and evidence of the complaint being instrumentalized are all signs that a grievance might be strategic. Mistaking strategic grievances for sincere ones has led many academics here in the West to fall for Russia's blame game. They argue that the United States humiliated Russia at the end of the Cold War and made the return to hostile relations all but inevitable. My thesis challenges this blame game narrative and argues that the West's greatest mistake was not to humiliate Russia, but to underestimate Russia and its subversive use of grievances. Thank you very much for listening. I'd like to say a special thanks to my wonderful advisor, Catherine Stoner, for her support and wisdom this past academic year. Special thanks also go to Dr. Siegart, Dr. Ewing, and Dr. Mir for running a fantastic CISAC honors program with wholehearted enthusiasm. Finally, thank you to my family, friends, and mentors for putting up my own grumbles and grievances this past academic year and for supporting me along the way. Dr. Siegart, I'll hand back to you.
Well done, Yasmin. Congratulations. We have no grievances with your grievance presentation. We're going to kick off the question and answer session with Dr. Stoner.
All right, I'll unmute myself. My only grievance is the picture of me that you used, but not your fault. Well, yeah, Yasmin, it is just such a pleasure to have watched this this presentation. When I think where we were just a little bit less than a year ago, it is wonderful to see how far you came, and you know, the contribution, I think, is as you listed there, and to create such a data set, I think is incredibly valuable as well. You also just did, you know, a wonderful set of interviews. It's a very great, the thesis is a really good example of mixed methodology. You used, you know, your knowledge and love of Russian history, both recent and older, references through the thesis, and then interviewing live policymakers about their time in government and their interactions with Russian actors. Two of them are here. And I know Fiona, from speaking to her recently about something else, enjoyed interacting with you as well. And so it's just a pleasure to see how far this has come. I suspect you will still get a lot of questions about what is an instrumental grievance versus a non-instrumental grievance. And you know, there's a little controversy in this thesis too, because you're really arguing against this realist perspective that it's our fault, we shouldn't have expanded NATO, and basically, you know, buying what I think is the Kremlin's main grievance or main line, which is, you know, no wonder any Russian leader would have reacted to this, but you demonstrate that actually that's not the case, right? As well. So I think that's extremely helpful. On the little cards with Lavrov, that's a great story, and that he carries those with, he carries his grievances close to his heart in his jacket, evidently. I can't remember, I don't think David Holloway is here, but someone else may have been at this talk a couple of years ago. We had some students come with the deputy head of the Russian Foreign Ministry School. You know, they have this master's in foreign affairs. So they came and they visited us. And so we went down to E008. I don't know if you guys remember, we have a building in Sina Hall, and in the basement there's that room E008. So we went down and we hosted them, and we had this large, intimidating picture of Andrei Sakharov. Probably not the right photo, in that you guys will know, those of you who know Encina Hall, in this particular conference room. So they were all forced to stare at that. And the deputy dean of the school started out, he pulled out his doklad, right, his presentation, and basically read a list of grievances against the United States, like we at Stanford we're going to be able to do anything about it that particular day. But anyway, a number of the students came up afterwards and said, we don't have the same opinions as he does. But yes, I think we've all been lectured at in our times in Russia. But I'm going to cede any more time that I may have to let other people ask you questions, as you still have a chance to make this thesis even stronger, a few more weeks. But thanks for the pleasure of working with you. It was a lot of fun and super interesting results.
Thanks, Catherine. So now we'll open it up for hard-hitting questions from our other faculty and students in the class. You can just raise your hand. Oh, Carter, first off the bat, and then we'll go to Professor Vardy, and I'll take a list. If you want to raise your hand, I'll put you in the queue. Go ahead, Carter.
So I really found that one graph you had, Yasmin, about the number of grievances in each year during the different terms. And I was just wondering, is there a certain personality or president who used grievances more than others? Like, could personality type perhaps be another reason for grievance usage?
Yeah, Carter, that's a great point. There's obviously variation across in grievances over time. And to me, that sort of variation reflects the dynamic nature of grievances, which politicians can, tactically inflate or deflate at opportunistic times. What the data shows is that the blame game has become much more aggressive under Putin's presidency, particularly in his third term. I think personality is definitely an interesting component to look at. So the personality of Putin, sort of more aggressively anti-Western, Medvedev being more sort of a sort of modernizer who's open to the West, and sort of Boris Yeltsin being kind of a flawed Democrat who's sort of bouncing between Russia and the West constantly. But perhaps a better sort of variable to look at that variation across the presidents is more their own sort of domestic and geopolitical agenda. So grievances are a really valuable political tool and tactic for Putin in his third term, once his own domestic legitimacy has come under question following sort of a wave of protests against Putin in 2012, as well as sort of Russia becoming much more powerful and willing to use grievances as sort of a gambit. Sort of like an interesting case of that is during the 2008 Bucharest summit, when NATO was discussing whether Ukraine and Georgia should be sort of invited into the alliance. And Condoleezza Rice was really a champion of that program. But Putin very strategically began to air grievances. You know, this is a red line. You must not invite Ukraine and Georgia into NATO. We will not allow it. And to me, that episode really shows the value and strategic advantage of grievances, because the European nations, particularly Germany, listened to those grievances and, in my opinion, mistook what was probably a strategic grievance for a sincere one, and so pretty much disbanded and vetoed the option to grant Ukraine and Georgia a path to membership. And of course, they are to this day no longer not members at all, and probably won't be for the foreseeable future. But thank you for your question, Carter.
Professor Verdi.
Thank you so much, Yasmin. Thank you for this very interesting and wonderful presentation. I want the history cap right back there where it belongs. Okay, and I think Jennifer is here with me on this one. But I will ask my question, which is, have you noticed any unique dynamics to grievances right before the use of force, after the relationship between grievances and the actual use of force?
Yes, that's a fantastic question, Professor Vardi. I think the best sort of case study for looking at the relationship between grievances and military force is to focus on the 2014 episode of the annexation of Crimea. So what we see instead of grievances sort of rising before, what I think you see is grievances actually following a military aggression and being used as a pretext and justification for that aggression. So, for example, a matter of weeks after Putin had invaded Crimea, we got his Crimea speech, when a sort of a very emotionally charged, grievance-laden address to the nation, he explained why Russia had annexed Crimea. And he used grievances against the West, against NATO, against American liberal hegemony as the sort of justification for why Russia had done that. And so that's sort of an example of a grievance being a legitimation tool for military aggression. I think it's a really fascinating question, especially for your field of military research, because I've come to the sort of conclusion that grievances help a state actor present themselves as on the defensive. You know, grievances portray Russia as the victim of Western wrongdoing, not the perpetrator of aggression. And so, you know, I think military tacticians often say that, you know, the best offense is defense. I would argue that Russia's best offense is to pretend to play defense, to portray itself as an actor that is retaliatory and defensive rather than aggressive. And by using grievances, it can always show that, you know, we're the victim, our hand was forced into this military aggression, rather than presenting itself as what it probably is as opportunistic. Thank you.
Dr. Rice.
Thank you. Yasmin, really fine work. And I think you know that I believe that your conclusions accord with what I experienced, including the note cards from Lavrov with the running grievances at every meeting. But I wanted you to talk about one alternative. I don't know if it's actually an alternative or rather just an adjustment to your notion, that it's not necessarily about military encirclement, so that the argument that you would not have seen a decline in military presence if they actually felt militarily threatened is a very strong argument. But we all know in the study of Russia there's also, let's call it psychological encirclement, the sense that the world is closing in on them, the concern about indefensible borders, even the sense that that Russia, the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union weren't natural entities. And so as things begin to unravel, first with the East European states, then with the Baltic states, and then you get into the color revolutions, that actually the grievances might start to take on a character of actual grievance rather than, or actual fears rather than just your grievances instrumentalized. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, thank you very much, Secretary Rice. And thank you for also generously letting me interview for my research. You're quite right. This thesis is ultimately about threat perception, and it is extremely difficult to enter the minds of the Russian political elite and think about how they perceive threat. And ultimately, to understand that, you would have to do some kind of psychological analysis, which I think is beyond the scope of my research and most political science research. But I think you're quite right that Russia presents a lot of its threats in the language of security. So it will appeal to terms like legitimate security interests, spheres of influence, red lines. But what it in fact is talking about is a psychological or ideological threat. And so it suggests that it's more tactical to present threats in security language when in fact they're probably ideological or ideological, psychological, as you say. To your sort of last point, can a grievance become what might be a sincere one? What might be a strategic one? Can it be a sincere one? I think it's a really interesting one. If you say a grievance enough times, does it become real in the minds and imaginations of the aggrieved nation? I think ultimately I can only speculate about that question. I would say that Putin, as he has become a much more paranoid leader, probably has become to believe some of the grievances that he has perpetuated for so long. I think some of his diplomats, especially Sergei Lavrov, who are just so talented and acute and intelligent, kind of know the game that they're playing and do it in a very mischievous and contrived way. But I think perhaps that's the most dangerous thing about Putin, is that he's come to sort of believe those grievances. We know, for example, that he receives a very narrow funnel of information, particularly that sort of focus on intelligence and can sort of have a sort of conspiratorial perception of the West. But thank you for your question.
So we're running short on time, but we're not going to leave without going to Dr. McFall and his question, with apologies to our broader audience. Mike, you get the last question, and Yasmin, you get the last word.
Well, I actually have 7 questions, Dr. Ziegard. So I'll just ask 1.5. A great presentation. I think that graph is really, really powerful on the NATO grievance, and I think, I'll read it later. I haven't read the text, but that you have all that variation and NATO being constant is just, I think, really powerful argument against those that say this is real. And when I say they, I mean the Mersheimers of the world. That graph just makes no sense. But one, I just wanted to echo something Condi said and then ask you a question, which I know you can't answer. I think this very interesting point that Condi made about different kinds of grievances and how they change over time. You and I talked about it. I think the NATO grievance is a very strategic one. The color revolution grievance seems to me to be one of those that, Georgia in 2003 didn't seem so threatening, but today maybe Putin has internalized that. That most certainly was my impression dealing with him when I used to. And I think maybe making that clear that different grievances can have different characteristics for that leader. I agree. I like Carter's point about individuals too. The unfair question I have, maybe this is for your PhD dissertation. What have you thought about, even just your intuition, because I'm sure you haven't done research on it yet. What are the effects domestically? Like if you just use a grievance forever and ever and ever, this NATO expansion thing, part of what is mysterious to me about it is, wouldn't it wear off? Like the bad guys, NATO and Nazis. Do you have any sense of that particular one? Because that was your case study. Why do they keep rolling it out? They must think that it must work. And yet I'm a bit perplexed that would be working out for your domestic level explanation.
Thank you for that question, Professor McFall. And thank you for also, I think I had 2 long interviews with you and you were enormously helpful. My answer to your question is, there is no single Russian individual that has an opinion on NATO or an opinion on the political elite's grievances. Russians are a very diverse group of people. What the data from the Levada Center, which is probably the most sort of reputable polling agency in Russia, what it suggests is that the NATO grievance exists amongst the Russian population. And it exists widely, and so it is a tactic that Russian leaders can use for domestic consumption because they can appeal to that. But of course, there are pockets of Russians, particularly the urban educated elite, particularly young Russians, the Russians that I met on my trips to the country, who are, fatigued by this grievance, who roll their eyes at it, who are clearly aware of its deceptive and subversive use. And so what that suggests is that, as we see more newer generations of Russians and political opposition to the regime mounts, the grievance, the strategic advantage of those grievances for domestic audiences will start to wear off because they'll lack credibility. It's sort of the cry the wolf problem. The more that the Russian political elite inflate the grievances, the more they start to lose credibility at home, and that's a serious problem on their hands. But thank you very much for listening, everyone. This has been a real delight. Thank you.
Please join me in congratulating Yasmin for a great presentation, but the thesis is not yet done. So you've gotten some great feedback that you can incorporate into your thesis before you submit it. We are now going to go to our second presenter, keeping in the theme of scary threats that require a lot of in-depth research. June Lee is our second presenter. June is majoring in international relations and minoring in computer science. Her course of study has focused on cyber policy and law, and she's been inspired, she writes, by her experiences in the Atlantic Council Cyber Statecraft Initiative and the State Department. Her thesis is extending and expanding on those interests by examining the US government's approach to public attribution in cyberspace. June's title is Strategic Publicity, Understanding US Government Cyber Attribution, and she has two very difficult thesis advisors, Professor Andy Grotto and me. So June, take it away.
On April 15th, President Biden imposed sanctions on Russia for a host of harmful activities, including an extensive cyber intrusion of sensitive government and private networks termed SolarWinds. The president formally attributed the cyber attack to Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service, signaling the US would impose costs if Russia continued its destabilizing conduct. Yet this wasn't the first time the government attributed the incident to Russia. On January 5th, intelligence and security agencies issued a joint statement on the likely Russian origins of the intrusion. On December 18th, 10 days after the first news reports on the incident, Secretary of State Pompeo claimed on a radio show, quote, "We can see pretty clearly it was the Russians." Public attribution, or assigning responsibility for a cyber attack to a nation state, is significant as it suggests a willingness to hold states accountable for cyber activities and has implications for the policy, diplomatic, or military action a government takes in response. The US has only recently begun to publicly attribute cyber attacks to other states and does so infrequently. My thesis thus asks, when and under what circumstances does the US government publicly attribute cyber intrusions to other states? The literature provides limited insight into the question of timing and lacks empirical studies. For this thesis, I compiled an original data set of 42 public attributions by the US government in the past decade and conduct 11 interviews with experts. I find the government does not publicly attribute through a unified process, but 4 distinct channels. Moreover, organizational factors influence the timing of this practice. In today's presentation, I provide a brief overview of the literature, then present my hypotheses and methods, findings, and results from one of my case studies. I'll conclude with implications for scholarship and policy. Buchanan and Ridd define attribution as determining who or what is responsible for an act. This question is present in all domains, but particularly interesting in cyber due to the potential anonymity afforded by the internet. Attribution can be split into 2 processes, an analytic process, or the technical forensic means of determining the responsible actor, and a strategic process, or how to communicate an attribution finding. The literature has gradually shifted from asking whether analytic attribution is even possible in cyberspace to the strategic question. And Egloff characterizes these processes as sense-making and meaning-making. An actor can choose to communicate an attribution publicly to a select audience or not at all. Public attribution involves an inherent trade-off between publicly disclosing an adversary's conduct and potentially exposing sensitive sources and methods used to make the attribution. This is the focus of my study. While attribution can be made at various levels, this thesis focuses on attribution to a nation state, which has implications for international relations. Scholars and policymakers frequently cite two bodies of literature to explain public attribution. Yet these studies provide limited insight into the question of timing. The covert action literature suggests states will only attribute an incident publicly when there's low risk of escalation. This is because a state decision not to publicly attribute an incident, thus maintaining secrecy, signals a desire to avoid conflict with the responsible adversary. The cyber deterrence literature suggests states should publicly attribute when they're prepared to back their statement with punitive measures, establishing deterrence by punishment. Public attribution without follow-on action could instead create a perception of impunity in cyberspace that further encourages this behavior. While policymakers frequently justify public attribution as intended to achieve deterrence, scholars debate the degree to which this theory applies in cyberspace. These literature, while providing some theoretical basis for public attribution, lack empirical studies and direct insight into the timing and circumstances of this practice. In this thesis, I examine three potential explanations. First, public attribution implicates US bilateral relations with the named adversary. Given escalation risks, I hypothesize public attribution is less likely under collaborative action or de-escalation, and more likely during periods of escalation. I also hypothesize public attribution is less likely when an adversary is perceived to pose significant threat in cyberspace. Second, domestic politics provide the context in which the government takes any public-facing action. I hypothesize that public attribution is likely when it is politically opportune, under divided government, low or declining presidential approval, and in close proximity to federal elections. Third, private sector entities, namely cybersecurity and internet companies, are active in attributing cyber intrusions and publicizing technical evidence to back their findings. I hypothesize that prior public attribution by a private entity, with disclosure of supporting evidence, eases the government's strategic trade-off and makes public attribution more likely. To conduct my study, I compiled a medium-end dataset that tracks public attributions by the US government to a state in the past decade. I consulted publications by different government agencies and news reports. For each incident, I tracked the timing of attribution from the date of first public disclosure of the incident to the first public attribution by the government. I also compiled a list of suspected nation-state cyber incidents from the Council on Foreign Relations Cyber Operations Tracker. These cases served as a baseline for cyber incidents in the public domain the government did not attribute publicly in the same period. I further conducted 11 interviews with former government officials, private sector security experts, and scholars. My dataset includes 42 public attributions and 33 suspected state cyber incidents from 2010 to 2020. These attributions targeted 4 states: Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. The timing ranged from 0 days to 7 years after public disclosure. It's important to note this is a data poor area due to government classification and the evolving nature of the field. This dataset is the most complete of its kind on US government public attribution and timing. Yet, as I'll discuss, there is no common methodology for determining what constitutes public attribution. Shifting parameters could result in slight variations of this dataset. While much of the theoretical literature assumes the US government is a unitary actor, I quickly found the government does not operate through a single coordinated process. Different agencies publicly attribute through different means, resulting in variation in scope, audience, and goals. To bring greater analytic clarity to this discussion, I developed an original framework of 4 channels through which the government issues public attributions. The technical channel involves technical alerts released by the Department of Homeland Security's cybersecurity agency, CISAC, and the FBI. The goal of this channel is to disclose technical details needed to patch vulnerabilities and support network operators in defending against future incidents. An example is this 2018 technical alert for North Korea's fast cash campaign, targeting ATMs globally. The criminal channel involves indictments and criminal complaints by the Justice Department and FBI. The goal here is to bring a criminal case against nation-state hackers that can stand in a court of law. An example is the 2014 indictment of 5 Chinese military hackers for cyber espionage. The official policy channel involves policy actions, such as public remarks and press releases, issued by senior officials in the White House and different agencies. The goal of this channel is to publicly reveal the state adversary responsible for a cyber intrusion. An example is the 2018 op-ed and press briefing by Homeland Security Advisor Tom Bossert, attributing the WannaCry ransomware to North Korea. Finally, the unofficial policy channel involves leaks by unnamed officials, often in major news outlets. The goal here is to shape the public narrative around a cyber incident when the discourse is classified or the government can't speak officially. An example is the 2017 Washington Post article in which unnamed officials attributed the hack of the Pyeongchang Olympics to Russia. Now, this channel is typically not included in the literature on public attribution, but I found it to be the most common means through which the government communicates its attributions publicly. Moreover, leaks are often treated in the press as a channel of government attribution. Organizing public attribution by the US government into these channels resulted in a number of significant findings. First, US public attribution began earlier and occurs more frequently than expected. My results are consistent with the general upward trajectory in public attributions discussed in the literature. However, I counted 2 unofficial statements prior to the indictment of Chinese hackers in 2014, commonly believed to be the first case of public attribution to a nation state by the US government. Moreover, by carefully examining government websites for each channel, I found almost 2 times as many US public attributions as the only previous list in the literature. By including unofficial statements in my dataset, as seen in yellow, I found the government has played a more active role in attributing and shaping the public narrative around a conflict than scholars often discuss. Second, the timing of public attribution varies systematically by channel. This box plot shows the distribution of attribution timings by channel. And what's important to note is that the median timing, marked by black arrows, varies significantly across channels, with unofficial statements occurring 11 days after public disclosure of an intrusion, and criminal charges taking over 2.5 years. Now, while the underlying processes are classified, the requirements for disclosing evidence and confidence level may offer some explanation for this trend. Unofficial statements, which are either unauthorized or directed by senior leadership, rarely involve disclosure of evidence, which would require extensive government approval processes. In contrast, criminal charges, technical alerts depend heavily on disclosure of evidence that can stand in a court of law or provide sufficient assistance to network defenders. While the exact times will shift as more public attributions take place, this variation by channel is significant. For my results to change, the established processes for publishing a criminal indictment or technical alert would have to occur much more quickly across many cases. Third, my hypotheses had little systematic effect on the timing of public attribution. My analysis suggests that bilateral relations, namely conflict acuteness, had some effect on public attribution timing. However, domestic politics and private sector attribution appear to have little effect. In today's presentation, I'll briefly highlight data from my first hypothesis, but I'm happy to discuss the others in the Q&A. My data suggests that public attribution, seen in the blue bars, is most likely during periods of conflict escalation and least likely during collaborative action or de-escalation, confirming my hypothesis. Yet the number of suspected state cyber incidents, in red, demonstrated similar variation across conflict stages. This consistency suggests that cyber is only one domain in bilateral relations, and that state cyber activities more broadly vary with conflict stage. Interestingly, I found the effect of conflict stage varied slightly by attribution channel. While the number of unofficial statements remained fairly consistent across stages, the number of criminal charges demonstrated greater variation. To further examine the mechanisms underlying this process, I conducted 2 case studies, one of which we'll examine today. On September 18th, 2012, a group calling itself the Cyber Fighters of Is Adin al-Qassam declared on an online forum that they would launch cyber attacks on the Bank of America and New York Stock Exchange as punishment for an anti-Muslim YouTube video called Innocence of Muslims. Over the next 8 months, a series of denial of service attacks targeted almost 50 of the largest US banks, with hundreds of millions of dollars in damage. From the start of the campaign, major news outlets speculated about potential links to the Iranian government. The US government quickly contributed to this narrative. 2 days after the campaign began, NBC News quoted unnamed national security officials who claimed the cyber attacks were being carried out by the government of Iran. The following month, the Wall Street Journal cited anonymous officials who blamed Iranian hackers with government ties for escalating a low-grade cyber war. 3 months later, the New York Times quoted Jim Lewis, a former senior official and known unofficial channel for the government, quote, "There is no doubt within the US government that Iran is behind these attacks." Finally, in March 2016, the Justice Department and FBI released a criminal indictment charging 7 government-affiliated Iranian hackers for the cyber campaign. Now, bilateral relations provide an unsatisfactory explanation for the timing of these attributions. While the 3 unofficial statements occurred during a period of escalation, the criminal charge followed the signing of the Iranian nuclear deal in June 2015, a time in which the US government would be incentivized not to take steps that could disrupt collaborative action. Private sector researchers also remained widely skeptical of hackers' links to Tehran and did not formally attribute the campaign or issue relevant technical reports. Careful assessment of the 3 unofficial statements suggests they were not coordinated within the government. To see this, I compared the 3 unofficial attributions on the left to 3 official statements for a non-cyber incident. In late 2020, the US Embassy in Baghdad, Secretary of State Pompeo, and a military spokesperson released separate statements attributing a recent missile strike on an Iraqi military base to Tehran. These 3 statements demonstrated strong consistency in the themes and language used and communicated a unified message to Iran that its actions violated Iraqi sovereignty. The relative lack of consistency or a clear message from the 3 unofficial statements suggests a lack of internal government coordination in this attribution process. Interviews and primary sources further suggest the Justice Department's commitment to prosecution shaped the public attribution process. In his book, Assistant Attorney General John Carlin recalls that the department's desire to issue an indictment arose from its mission of prosecuting those responsible for unlawful conduct. He notes, quote, "We wanted to establish that prosecutions were normal. We were going to prosecute people we caught stealing or attacking American interests, regardless of who they were." Now, the Justice Department pursued an indictment despite opposition from many other agencies who worried attribution brought too many complications to sensitive bilateral relations. A senior official interviewed for this project suggested the Justice Department was able to pursue an indictment as it lacked an international policy shop that could elevate these diplomatic concerns. Public attribution of Operation Babel thus lacked a single coordinated process and was driven within government by the Justice Department's mission and internal logic. This observation is not unique to this particular case and leads to my final finding. Channel-specific organizational factors influence the timing of public attribution. In Essence of Decision, Graham Allison writes that government action may be the output of large independent organizations. While the exact government processes aren't known publicly, my dataset and case studies suggest that organizational factors specific to the attributing agency, including its mission and culture, authorities in cyberspace, leadership, and organizational priorities, influence and can even drive the public attribution process. Rather than a top-down approach directed by the White House or influenced systematically by external factors, public attribution operates through a bottom-up approach in which the logic and agenda of different agencies shapes the timing of this practice. My research has a number of implications for scholarship and policy. First, my thesis demonstrates the assumption of the government as a unitary actor, common in this literature, lacks analytic rigor. Future work should consider ways in which the lack of a unified approach complicates the application of theories on covert action or signaling. My findings also emphasize the importance of empirical study in understanding state cyber activities. Despite data limitations, focusing on known activities, such as public attribution, and trackable variables, such as timing and circumstances, advances our knowledge of drivers for state activity in cyberspace. And third, my channels framework highlights the importance of unofficial means for shaping the public narrative and invites further study into this field. For policy, my thesis has implications for signaling through public attribution. The lack of a unified process suggests there may be a mismatch between adversaries' perception of public attribution as a policy action coordinated by the White House reflective of a unified agenda and the real policy processes. This highlights the need for clear objectives and communication on those objectives when pursuing public attribution. And finally, public attribution can shape international norms on what states can do in cyberspace. Policymakers can consider the ways in which the US's current approach to public attribution impacts the content and development of these norms. And in closing, this thesis would not be where it is today without the support of a number of people. First, I'd like to thank my advisors, Mr. Andrew Gatto and Dr. Amy Ziegert. Cyber attribution is not the easiest topic, but you've been the most incredible and supportive mentors throughout this thesis process. One could even say we should attribute some responsibility for this thesis to you. I'd also like to thank the rest of the teaching team, Dr. Rod Ewing, Dr. Amir, for guiding us through this process in the midst of a pandemic. And thank you to my family, friends, and mentors for your constant support. And with that, I am open to questions.
Well done, June. Congratulations on a terrific presentation. So if you've just tuned into our honors thesis presentations and you're viewing the webinar, I just want to remind everybody, you too can ask questions. If you write your question in the Q&A tab at the bottom. We're going to go to Professor Grotto first, then I get a crack at June, then we're going to open it up to other folks in the class, and then if we have time, we'll open it up to everybody else. Professor Grotto, over to you.
Well, thank you, June. Great job. I want to give a shout to your courage and your research chops, your courage for picking a cyber topic, which present many methodological challenges, not least of which is the data challenge, and your research chops for figuring out how to, draw some really compelling findings from a limited data set. So major kudos, and it's just been a pleasure to spend the past few months working this through with you and supporting your efforts. There have been times where I feel like in some ways I'm kind of in therapy, having been involved for my time in government in many of the attribution decisions that occurred, up through 2017, and in some ways, the mark of good research is when you get a bruise in your forehead from the duh, of course that's how it works. And June's insight about the government and these 4 channels, not offering a sort of a unified, unitary approach to attribution, I think is certainly spot on and a very insightful finding. My question is, and I want to apologize in advance. I mentioned this to June. I have to leave right at 3 o'clock to go pick up one of my minions from school. So if I disappear at 3 o'clock, that is why. My question, June, is, in the 4 channels, the unofficial channel presents, some unique challenges. there are sort of, at least two different ways that a government actor could use that channel, right? One could be an actor is sanctioned by some appropriate authority within the government to go talk to the press. That happens. In other cases, though, an actor will leak and will sort of go rogue and maybe talk out of turn. How do you distinguish between those in your unofficial channel?
Yeah, no, thank you so much for the question, Professor Gatto, and I really appreciate all your assistance throughout this year. I think you raise a really interesting question, because that's one of the, I think, research queries that was really raised by my inclusion of the unofficial channel as a channel for government attribution, because as you said, it can be either unauthorized, right, or directed by the senior leadership. And how can, as an external observer, how can we know which of the two it was? And I think through my research, I wasn't able to find a clear methodology for distinguishing what was the case. But I think that, as seen in kind of my case study, my observation was that regardless of whether it was authorized or not, there doesn't seem to be kind of a coordinated approach within the government to these unofficial attributions, as in, to the degree that any kind of public attribution is a tool of signaling and sends a message to external actors or the adversary, we would expect if there was a coordinated process for these messages to perhaps be coordinated, or for there to be some kind of unifying message communicated. But as seen in my case study, and this was found in a lot of the other cases as well, there doesn't seem to be that unified thread. And because of that, I thought that, functionally, maybe it doesn't matter whether it was really directed by senior leadership or unauthorized, because of the lack of kind of strategic thinking behind the government's use of leaks.
So I'm going to now go to me and ask it. And first, let me add to what Professor Grotto said, June. The degree of difficulty of this dive is incredibly high. And I think I want to go a step further. It's not just what you made of the data, it's the data that you made. So what you've done is you've created the best data set on attribution of cyber incidents in the United States anywhere. And so one of the things you need to do is contact CFR, Council on Foreign Relations, and tell them they need to actually refine their data set with yours, because it's significantly better. So that's alone is a great contribution. So congratulations to you for that. I want to push you a little bit on the normative implications of your findings. So the argument that it's sort of channel driven and there's no strategic direction guiding the timing of attribution maybe isn't such a bad thing. So tell us a little bit more about why you think that is normatively bad for policy, or why it actually might be a benefit to have channel driven attribution timing decisions, given that other states, particularly non-democratic states, don't face any of these kinds of dynamics and have different signaling sort of drivers of when or if they publicly attribute at all.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question, Dr. Ziegler, and also thank you for all of your advice and constantly pushing me throughout this year. I think in response to your question, whether it's normatively good or bad for public attributions to be driven by the channel, I think that kind of the conclusion I was getting at was that the government, to the degree that this process is kind of bottom up and driven at the channel level, the government isn't using public attribution strategically enough, right? As I kind of mentioned to Professor Gatto, unofficial attributions, they signal something. Criminal charges, they signal something to the international community and to the state adversary. And to the degree that the kind of channels and agencies are driving this on their own, the government is missing a really valuable opportunity to kind of coordinate the message they're sending through their public attributions and define much clearer lines in terms of what constitutes permissible behavior in cyberspace. And I found this to be really significant, because I think that norm building in cyberspace is kind of a hot topic right now, and something that kind of states struggle a lot with, because it's difficult to find kind of international agreement on what constitutes a set of norms that states can really agree to, just because of different ideological beliefs. But I think that public attribution is kind of almost like a low-level way that the US government can really set clear, maybe communicate more clearly, here are things that we believe are not permissible, without without really putting its foot on the stake, as in that public attribution is commenting that this, Russia did this, China did this. This is a way for the US to comment on what it believes is or is not permissible without stating that we believe this is a use of force, or using formal international legal language that can have further implications the US might not want to impose. So that might be kind of an overall take.
Other questions from the class? Before we have a couple questions from the audience, I want to be sure we go to a rapid fire round before we end the class. So other questions from the class for June? Okay, seeing none, I will raise a question by one of our previous honor students, Catherine Arajpana, who says, "Hi June, congratulations. The policy-oriented question is this: when do you believe it's appropriate to make a public attribution? If the US faces a cyber attack and the adversary is ambiguous, how do you think policymakers should proceed?"
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think that's something I'm going to have to think a little bit more about and maybe include in my conclusion for the written thesis. But kind of an initial take I have is that, and what I've been discussing, that public attribution, when it's made, even unofficially, has strategic consequences. And the government needs to, I think each agency has to be a little bit more mindful about what effect any public attribution has and how that contributes to the broader public narrative being created by the government writ large. And I think the Biden administration recognizes the kind of strategic significance of public attribution. There was recently an interesting article that was, the title was, I think, US government promises to name adversary behind Chinese-backed cyber attack. And this is in response to the Microsoft Exchange hack. But I think there's a growing recognition that, or there is recognition that public attribution has a lot of strategic effects. And I think that for each channel and even individual leakers to recognize what impact that might have, I think that's an important step in considering when public attribution might be appropriate.
So with thanks to Dr. Mir for the non-public attribution, that Professor Sagan had a question. I didn't see his hand. Professor Sagan, you're next.
That's a great job, June. I've got a hypothesis. I wonder if you say whether you see any evidence for this. I would think that one reason why a government might not want to have a public attribution, even if it has the technical knowledge, would be that they've got bigger fish to fry. You're involved in a negotiation. You're worried that attribution of this would ruin that other negotiation. And so you withhold the evidence till afterwards. So that would suggest, for example, that accusations about Iran come after the JCPOA is signed, not before, that Biden would issue the attribution to Russia after the New START agreement is formalized, and that the Trump administration would be cautious about attributing things to North Korea until the summits failed with Kim Jong-un. Conversely, you would think that unofficial leaked things would be by people who are opposed to the bigger, what I call the bigger fish to fry. They were opposed to that negotiation, so they're trying to derail it. Do you see any evidence of that particular dynamic going on?
Yeah, thank you so much for the question, Professor Sagan. I think that you raise a really good and important point. And to a certain degree, I think that kind of those bigger fish to fry, that influences the White House or maybe NSC's thinking on whether or not through maybe the official channel, should we be publicly attributing this incident? But kind of as I discussed in my case study, what I found was that more than anything, those organizational factors still play a driving role. In that when the Justice Department, they pursued the indictment for a very long time, for 3 years following kind of public disclosure. Other agencies would always find a reason why this is not the right time, right? We are doing something with Iran right now. Perhaps they were conducting behind the scene negotiations with Iran. There was always something going on, and I think that that like final push by an agency driven by their mission or by certain organizational factors that seem to be more of a determinative factor of whether or not public attribution would occur within that broader context of diplomatic relations.
So I am mindful of the time. I see Ambassador Eikenberry, you're going to get the last question. June, you get the last word. There's some great questions in the Q&A that we're going to then collect so you can think about them as you revise your thesis, June. So Ambassador Eikenberry, over to you.
Thanks, Amy. June, a terrific presentation. Thanks for the invitation to attend. June, the problem that you're looking at is 10 plus years old, and the data that you use goes back, as I recall, to 2010. So the emergence of cyber and cyber attribution for our government in the lifespan of problems for governments is still relatively brief. And then we start moving forward, then you've got the disruption of the Snowden disclosures in 2013, which put everybody back on their heels. Then you have the Trump administration. They didn't get high marks for interagency coordination. Perhaps that's unfair in the domain we're looking at now. But then as we get to the Biden administration, is there a possibility now that we've just got it's a fairly steep learning curve, but a Biden administration that has a coherent interagency process might be able to get a better grip on this, and that, say, 4 years hence, your results would look quite different?
Yeah, thank you so much for the question, Professor Eikenberry, and thank you for joining today. I think the point you raised as well about kind of trends over time and a broader, the interference of different events like Snowden leaks, that plays an important role in the government's thinking on publicity, intelligence, and its activities in cyberspace. I think looking at the legacy from kind of the first, second Obama administration, when public attributions really began, to the Trump administration, what was perhaps surprising to me was kind of the continuing lack of apparent top-down kind of coordination of this public attribution. But one train of thought that I've kind of been pulling at, and I've mentioned to Dr. Ziegert as well, is this idea of collective attribution. This is something that, especially in the Trump administration, the US began engaging in more of, but kind of coordinating these public attribution statements with its allies and partners, whether that's the Five Eyes or it's these European countries. And public attributions, when they're made by multiple countries on a unified front, appears to have more of an impact on adversaries' cyber conduct. For instance, there's a lot of theories on kind of naming and shaming in cyberspace, and the suggestion that by simply publicly attributing an adversary, they will feel shame, or that will deter them from engaging in future cyber conduct or those activities. And I found those discussions to be very unconvincing, especially because of the nature of the adversaries engaging in these activities, whether that's Iran, North Korea, Russia, and China. But I think that kind of collective attribution is this trend that appears to be emerging and that states are working on, of kind of taking a more strategic, cooperative approach to cyber and seeing if public attribution can be employed as a means, as part of the US's strategy of that more partner-based approach to cyber. And I think that's one way that maybe 4 years from now, I might be able to come back and say that we now take a more strategic approach to public attribution. I think.
We've come to the end of our time. Congratulations, Yasmin and June. Terrific job. I want to thank the advisors again for coming and remind everybody we're not done. We have 2 more honor sessions. The next 2 weeks will be at our regular class time, which is Thursdays beginning at 2:30. Thanks, everybody, and hope to see you next week.